Origins of drugs in the U.S. In the 1800s, opium arrived in America with Chinese immigrants working on railroads and in cities, and patent medicines filled with morphine, cocaine, and other addictive substances were sold openly to treat everything from headaches to fatigue, quietly creating a culture of dependence. People used these medicines without realizing their dangerous effects, and addiction began spreading in urban communities. Public concern slowly grew, but laws were almost non-existent. By the late 1800s, newspapers started reporting on opium dens and the rising misuse of cocaine and morphine. These early cases revealed a hidden problem that would grow across decades, setting the stage for America's first major struggle with drugs and addiction, laying the foundation for centuries of legal, social, and public health challenges that would follow. Cocaine craze. By the early 1900s, cocaine had become widely available in tonics, elixirs, and even Coca-Cola, with doctors prescribing it for fatigue, depression, and many common ailments. Americans consumed it freely, thinking it was safe, and cities began to notice the rise of addiction. Reports of violent behavior and dependence started emerging, raising alarms in some communities, yet no federal regulations existed. Cocaine's popularity highlighted the dangers of unregulated drugs and marked the beginning of a nationwide concern. By the 1910s, reformers called for restrictions, leading to the first limited drug laws, though enforcement was weak. This period demonstrated how powerful substances could quietly spread through society, shaping both culture and public health and showing that the seeds of addiction could grow unnoticed until they became a national issue. Prohibition and marijuana. During Prohibition in the 1920s, alcohol became illegal across the United States, and many Americans turned to marijuana as a substitute, especially in jazz clubs and artistic communities. Politicians and newspapers portrayed marijuana as dangerous, associating it with crime and marginalized groups, while propaganda like "reefer madness" fueled fear nationwide. Laws began to criminalize its use, often targeting minority communities unfairly, and public opinion shifted against the substance. Marijuana became both a cultural symbol of rebellion and a political target, showing how fear and politics could drive drug policy. By the end of the 1920s, marijuana was firmly labeled as a threat, marking one of the first significant national drug campaigns in the country's history, setting a precedent for decades of regulation and prohibition that followed. Heroin after World War II. After World War II, heroin became more widely available in American cities, partly due to returning soldiers who had used it overseas. Addiction began spreading quietly in inner-city neighborhoods, while the government largely ignored the growing problem. Doctors continued prescribing morphine and other opioids for pain, and communities faced rising health and social issues without adequate support. Reports of crime, overdoses, and hospitalizations increased, yet public awareness remained limited. By the early 1950s, heroin was becoming a serious urban problem, and authorities struggled to respond effectively. This era demonstrated how addiction could grow under the radar, creating long-term consequences for families and cities and foreshadowing the larger drug epidemics America would face in the following decades. The cartels arrive. In the 1970s and 1980s, Latin American drug cartels, including the infamous Medellin cartel led by Pablo Escobar, became the primary suppliers of cocaine to the United States. The drug trade exploded in scale and violence, fueled by huge profits and high demand from American users. Smuggling routes crossed borders, and law enforcement struggled to keep up. Communities in major cities saw rising crime rates, while politicians promised to curb the flow but failed to stop it. Cocaine became a symbol of wealth, danger, and addiction, and the U.S. faced a powerful international network it could not easily dismantle. By the 1980s, the drug problem had grown from a local issue into a national crisis, showing that supply, demand, and global networks were unstoppable by laws alone. Crack cocaine epidemic. By the mid-1980s, crack cocaine emerged in poor urban neighborhoods, offering a cheaper, more addictive form of cocaine that quickly devastated communities. Families were torn apart, crime rates soared, and prisons became overcrowded. The media sensationalized the epidemic, often portraying it as a problem in African American communities while ignoring the underlying social issues. Legislation imposed harsher penalties for crack than powder cocaine, intensifying racial disparities in incarceration. The epidemic demonstrated that law enforcement alone could not solve the problem, and it exposed the deep social and economic inequalities that fueled addiction. The crack crisis became a defining moment in America's drug history, showing the deadly combination of poverty, inequality, and highly addictive substances. The war on drugs. In 1971, President Nixon declared drugs the public enemy number one, and by the 1980s, the Reagan administration launched the war on drugs, pouring billions into policing, border enforcement, and incarceration. Despite these efforts, supply continued to flow, cartels adapted, and prisons filled with non-violent drug offenders. While officials celebrated arrests and seizures, addiction rates remained high, and social problems persisted. The war on drugs highlighted the limits of using punishment alone to address a public health issue. Communities continued to struggle with addiction, and experts began calling for prevention and treatment approaches. The policies showed that enforcement without social support could not stop the cycle of drugs in America. Why the war failed? Despite massive spending, strict laws, and aggressive enforcement, the war on drugs failed to reduce addiction or trafficking. Cartels adapted quickly, synthetic drugs appeared, and demand continued unabated. High incarceration rates disrupted families without preventing drug use, and social inequality made communities more vulnerable to addiction. Experts argued that prevention, education, and healthcare were as important as enforcement, yet policy lagged behind. The failure of the war on drugs revealed that addiction is not just a criminal issue but a social and public health problem. Without addressing the root causes, the cycle of drugs and crime would continue to plague the nation. Opioid crisis. In the 2000s, prescription painkillers like OxyContin became widely available, and pharmaceutical companies aggressively marketed them to doctors, downplaying their addictive potential. Millions of Americans, from suburbs to rural towns, became addicted, and overdoses soared. Doctors overprescribed while insurers and regulators failed to act in time. Communities were overwhelmed, and families struggled to cope with addiction, leading to one of the deadliest drug epidemics in American history. The opioid crisis revealed how profit-driven industries, combined with public demand, could fuel a national health disaster. It also demonstrated that lessons from past drug wars had not been fully learned. Present and lessons. Today, drugs like fentanyl, methamphetamine, and synthetic opioids continue to devastate communities across the United States, affecting cities, suburbs, and rural areas alike. Experts emphasize prevention, treatment, and social support as more effective than punishment alone. While law enforcement targets supply, the underlying causes of addiction, poverty, lack of healthcare, mental illness, and social inequality remain. Communities are fighting back with education, rehabilitation, and awareness programs. The story of drugs in America is a century-long lesson in human, social, and political cost, showing that without understanding the people and the problems behind the substance, addiction will continue to cycle across generations, leaving devastation in its wake.